Today I'm going to be reviewing this book, this old little gold nugget from the beginning of the 90s. If you take nothing else from this video, take that you should read this book. It's very short, a few pages, like 300 something, 200 something. Wow, you're lucky. History books are a difficult genre because it's so much harder. It's hard in fiction to decide what's important and what's not. But it's even harder with history, where there is an infinite amount of facts that you could put in. So the art of the historian, the person writing historical nonfiction, the art becomes creating the story, the narrative, and the explanations so that we as humans are engaged. It's so easy for history to simply become names, actions, and dates and numbers instead of becoming emotion and human interaction. And really, history is all about humans. It starts when we have the written word. It starts with humans. And not just when humans exist, but when we do stuff, we interact with the world, we leave something behind. It's about human interaction, so that's an important thing to remember. Why am I saying this? I'm saying it because I've read a lot of historical books by now, and the best of them are the ones that manage to create this sense of human wonder, I would call it, just human engagement, human interaction, this feeling that even though there are hundreds of years between you and these people that you're reading about, they feel like people. This is very difficult, but this book manages to do that. And it does so by really picking a narrow scope for its story. It has a very focused narrative, and it's a very interesting one. One of the things that I find so very interesting about history is how really we humans haven't changed much. It's the same dynamics, it's the same emotions, and the same types of actions that we keep going through because we share that common nature. And that's what I find so very interesting, and that's what the good history books confirm. When Jesus Became God is about toward the end of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire really isn't as strong as it used to be, hence why it's toward the end. And to a lot of people, it seems like this also has to do with Christianity, because they feel like Christianity is undermining the culture, because the culture at this time in Rome is very focused on, like, we have a pantheon of gods, and we have many different types of gods, and they don't really like the Jews and the Christians who come along and are like, there's one God, and if you don't worship our God, you're going to hell. Like, it's just, they don't seem like really chill people, do they? And they, of course, the most important part is, of course, that they refuse to sacrifice to the Roman gods, which is a problem because we want the gods to be on our side. So if a large part of our population aren't sacrificing to the gods, well, now the gods don't like us, and the empire is going down the drain. And so at this point, the Roman emperors are really just trying to get rid of the Christians. And they struggle. They struggle for survival, and for a while it actually seems like, wow, okay, Christianity is not going to be a thing. But then along comes Constantine the Great. That's a very hard sentence to say. But along comes Constantine the Great, and he is the first emperor to be baptized. He doesn't get baptized until he dies, but he basically starts favoring Christianity quite early in his reign. And he views Christianity as an opportunity, a way of gathering the people. He sort of understands that in this new way of life, people have a desire to feel. What people need is a religion that gives more of a spiritual vibe. So far, religion has been very much an external thing, but now it becomes an internal thing. You can save your soul by becoming a better person. And people like this. It gives them a sense of agency. And so he starts to support it. And the point is, without having to summarize all of the story, is that as Christianity finds its feet, a schism starts to happen between the Arians and, for a lack of better term, the non-Arians. Basically, the discussion is, was Jesus a man or was he God? Was he God's son, or was he God? And so the Arians believe that Jesus was God's son. He was a human who became divine through his actions and through the favor of God. And they believe that we can all become equally good through our actions and become equally beloved in God's eyes through good conduct. I should probably do a disclaimer in this book that I am absolutely an atheist. This topic is interesting to me because humans are interesting and religion is a big part of humans, so that makes religion interesting. And I find it absurd how much people care about religion because I'm an atheist, so I don't care. But I know people do. So I find it interesting. I just feel like that's a disclaimer that we should put out there. So by no means I'm a culture Christian, but I'm an atheist. On the other side, we have the non-Arians who believe that God and Jesus are the same person. And this is important, even though it sounds schizophrenic, right? And it's eventually what Catholicism ends up being all about, a Holy Trinity. But the problem is, if Jesus is divine, but he's also God's son, then we basically have two gods, right? And then if you have two gods, what's to stop us from having three? What's to stop us from saying that Mariah is divine? Or that some of the archangels are also basically gods. And at the same time, they didn't want to put Jesus down on the level of an angel. So that's why it was important to the non-Arians that Jesus and God were the same. And it's such a weird conversation when you're standing outside because you're like, one, does it matter? And two, how? Like, what is this even about? Because it seems so schizophrenic to an atheist, right? You're like, how can Jesus be God when he hangs on the cross and is like, Dad, why did you betray me? Why have you left me? And how can he do that and still be God? But then it's like, well, God puts some part of himself in Jesus, okay, so it's like a lesser part of God, and like, well, how does it work? And it fosters, obviously these earlier Christians are just as confused as I am right now. They're asking the same questions, and that's leading to all of these discussions. And basically what happens is that these two sides end up really hating each other and viewing each other as unorthodox. And this is where things get interesting and so funny. This book is funny if you understand to appreciate the irony of humanity. Because what happens is just that they start warring against each other. And yes, sometimes people are killed, but basically what happens is that they gathered these huge masses of people who are like so intensely invested in being Aryan or non-Aryan, and people die over this, and people are burned at the stake. But at the same time, it's like, we're Christians, so we can't kill each other. So instead, what these bishops do at this time, because there's not really any pope yet, but there's bishops, and they're very, very powerful because the big bishops, they have control over large areas. And these popes, they just keep sending each other in exile. So you have the Pope of Alexandria, Athanasius, I think he's called, and he's very important. He's a non-Arian, and he keeps being sent away from Egypt in exile, and he flees into the desert. He flees west to where people are more non-Arian. And then he keeps returning because every time the Arians exile a non-Arian, the non-Arians will just be like, well, that doesn't count, and vice versa. So eventually Constantine the Great is like, okay, we're gonna need to have like a big meeting and be like, just settle this thing because this is just boiling, you know. But the problem is that Constantine doesn't really appreciate how much the Christians care, because he is a Christian, but he's not a theologian, you know, he's not a priest. So he's kind of like, well, this should be easy to settle. Spoiler alert, it's not, because they really care. So what I ultimately find so great about this book is, one, it's just written very easily. Like, it's easy to read, because the author, he's very good at bringing back things from before. He's very good at gently introducing things, and he's very good at callbacks and at repeating things. And ultimately, he's very good at picking the characters who are our main characters. So the important emperors like Constantine, we really get into those, and Athanasius and Arius and some of the other big priests within both sides. And he's very good at making clear when this is fact and this is speculation, and we could imagine things to be like this. And I think that those parts where historians say, well, we don't know this, but let's imagine, and we can imagine that perhaps in this situation they would have felt this or they would have felt that. And even though it's speculation, the important thing is that it's giving an emotional backdrop in order for us to hang up all of the facts, for us to live in the story that we're listening to and not just hear numbers and names, because we're not going to remember that. So I think it's just a very good historical book. It's fast, it's short. I really recommend it. And also just because it's an interesting study in humans. One of the most important things that I observed in this book was that, so at the beginning, the Christians are very united because the Romans are trying to kill them. So it's like, well, if we fight each other, we're gonna die. So they really... they stick together. Then the first schism happens where, as things soften for the Christians, while the Romans were persecuting the Christians, many Christians were forced to sacrifice to the pagan gods. And now that then afterwards, when the Christians are no longer in such danger, some people are going like, well, if you sacrifice to the pagans, then you can't be a bishop, you can't be a holy person because you did sacrilege against the religion. And then others are like, no, it's not so important how holy you are. It's the position that's holy. Guess which part wins out? But they basically fight a bit about it and kill each other a little over it before the scores are settled and things are decided on. And then later you have this schism of the Arians versus the non-Arians. Now they're killing each other over this and being very internally strong, because if they falter in the least bit, they're going to lose to the other side. So first, Christian versus Romans. The Christians sort of win culturally, and then they split up into Arians and non-Arians. They are very tight within their core groups, but fighting with each other. And then eventually what happens is that the Arians sort of win out. And then within their group, you have the conservatives who are like, yeah, Jesus was a man, but he was divine. He was chosen to be divine from his very conception by God. And then others who are very radical and are being like, no, Jesus was just a man, and he was a good man, and so God decided to raise him up into divinity. And then they war within each other, and the great thing is, they're all just killing each other at every step of this way. But it's like, objectively speaking, for a Christian, isn't the discussion of whether or not you're a Christian, whether you believe in God, isn't that the more important question than whether God and Jesus are one or if they're separate, and in which way they're separate? But humans are so darn frustrating because we just treat each of these questions on equal par. Now this is just the new arena where we're killing each other. Instead of saying, well, we've actually gotten pretty far. This is pretty good. Like, we can still sort of discuss these things, but let's agree, it's details at this point, guys. And that's what I mean by history being such an interesting view into humanity. It's that, I mean, this is so reminiscent of some of the political wars right now, where it's just like people are discussing things that sometimes feel so irrelevant and blown out of proportions, and where people are screaming at each other, and it's like, chill out, just talk with each other. Most likely you probably agree on a lot of things, but things just become so extreme that people feel the need to be so heinous toward each other. And this is just such a great example of it. And the distance of 2,000 years means that it's so much easier to observe from as like just a cold observer, instead of getting caught up in the intricacy of it, because I don't care whether God or Jesus is one thing. one thing makes more sense to me logically, but that's one thing. But I don't really care what you figure out with your religion. Go do your religion. I don't care. So yeah, 5 stars for this book from me. I really, really love it. I am very sure, very, very sure that there are Christians out there who are frustrated with the take in the book. I read some talk about how it's not Jesus becoming God, it's God who became a man to save all of humanity. But I again think that's a bit of a nitpicky way of critiquing things. The point here is the story of how people came to the conclusion that Jesus and God are one, and came to the conclusion that we believe in the Holy Trinity. And the point is that story of how politically that was a choice. And we humans decided how to do the religion, and it could have gone another way. And that's what I find so interesting.